Good evening. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast here on Friday night with quite a bleak title for this evening's broadcast: The War on the Unvaccinated. This is a pretty dark conversation for a Friday evening, but an important conversation to have. But during this episode, I'll be talking about what's been happening in the world relating to the COVID response, particularly reference to the nature of the unvaccinated within policy response, and exploring what is leading to this and what can be done to tackle rising medical apartheid or medical fascism, however you want to describe this. So, what is the term "the war on the unvaccinated"? It seems there is a full-fronted assault on those who are choosing not to be vaccinated, or those who are unable to get vaccinated for their own medical reasons or other choices, through a variety of means. Firstly, the vaccine passports, which, of course, discriminate based upon your own medical choices, whether you can access certain portions of society through establishments, events, etc. Then you've got the vaccine mandates within the UK. We see them in the care homes, within the hospitals, potentially going into next year, various other settings and private settings, and different parts of the world. Different employment sectors are affected, where people are essentially being forced to make the decision to either be vaccinated or lose their employment, and various other situations which are enforcing various different choices of this vein. This, by the way, people are insisting that you do have a choice. However, what's really happening is people are effectively removing everything that you have in order to leave you with no other choice. And the same is now happening with unvaccinated only lockdowns, where we're now seeing unvaccinated lockdowns in Austria, the Czech Republic, the Slovakia, Germany, now with unvaccinated only restrictions, and the Netherlands and Italy lining up. So what we can see here is what you permit, you promote. This is now very much a problem that is becoming widespread across Europe and likely the rest of the world. It's already speculated in the press in the last 24 to 48 hours whether this will come to the UK. The only thing going in the UK's favour at this very moment is that our COVID trends are not following the same path as countries like Slovakia, Austria, Netherlands, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, which have all seen an uptick in cases in recent weeks. Some countries like Slovakia, Austria, Netherlands, Germany have seen a relatively rapid and steep ascent in terms of its caseloads. But we could talk about the reasons why we're seeing high cases in these areas. We could break down the analysis of the different waves that each of the different countries that they've gone through to start to make some sense of why different countries are distributing cases and things in such different ways. But this is not about sense. This is not about sense making. This episode isn't about sense making when it comes to the cases. But in the macro level, this isn't about sense either. Similarly, we could talk about the correlation or the links between the volume of vaccinations that have been administered and the increased cases and deaths within the countries that have had highest levels of vaccinations. Remembering that the purpose of these vaccinations was obviously intended to be part of the exit plan, allegedly, from this pandemic. But again, the authorities don't want to confront the fact that these trends exist and are continuing to push with force the idea that every single person needs to be vaccinated, or your access to society, your privileges will be removed. And worse, there's already talk in Austria of large fines and even imprisonment for failing to comply with the unvaccinated only lockdowns, which which have now actually, in terms of full transparency, that these Austrian lockdowns have now become full lockdowns. And again, um, lockdowns, the evidence is pretty clear that they don't positively affect the trajectory of cases or mortality. There's been endless papers, endless analysis that have invalidated the use of lockdowns. We're simply not learning. These lockdowns will continue to cause grievous harm to countries, to society, to individuals, to industries, continuing to flatline the economy, continuing to put pressure on people's lives, continuing to erode the healthcare systems, continuing to place people under mental anxiety and stress. But again, we don't need to look at the evidence. The evidence is clear. The evidence is being ignored by authorities. There is nothing further that could be more obvious that the powers that be, the centralized institutions and organizations that are responsible for these policies, have become drunk on power. They've lost control of reality. They're in a sense. They're in a world of mass hysteria, and are utilizing these situations to further advance this level of control over society. So this very much starts to feel like a war on the unvaccinated. It's an ideological war. It's not about evidence. We could look at the evidence of transmission and all those pieces, but the evidence just doesn't seem to matter. None of the evidence around lockdowns seem to matter. None of the evidence around vaccines seem to matter. None of the evidence around the wider harm seems to matter. Evidence is gone. It has no value in the modern society, according to these authoritarian rulers. It's all about ideology. But my question is, who has determined that vaccines are a moral imperative in order to participate in society? Who made that decision? Which authority, which individuals, which leaders have made these judgments that it is now a moral imperative to be vaccinated to enter society? And therefore, in making that imperative, essentially quite clearly discriminating with force and aggression to those who do not comply with that moral imperative that has been assumed by the organizations like the central institutions, governments, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, either tacitly or directly, as well as Big Pharma. And we have to ask ourselves, so in these types of situations, who is it that stands to gain from these policies? Because quite clearly, with vaccine passports, for instance, there is a huge benefit to the pharmaceutical industry. There's a huge financial benefit to the digital identity industry, and there's a huge benefit to governments, in terms of their level of surveillance and control over society. The same with mandates, and now similarly these lockdowns, which again, unvaccinated lockdowns are likely to be part of the process of trying to drive behaviors towards increasing vaccinations. But the reality is, the harder governments push, the more people will resist. It's a simple fact. And again, if we were talking about facts, and we were talking about evidence, all of the psychological evidence, all of the papers that are written about how to increase vaccine take-up actually speak to the opposite of what the governments are doing. The harder they drive, the more people will resist. The same with boosters now. This third shot in the UK. People are starting to lose faith in the government. Those who have complied, even those who have complied. Many of us lost faith in the government a long time ago. But even those who have become complied to have their double vaccination are now considered partially vaccinated or unvaccinated, despite following through the first two requests, and now being faced with a third and likely a fourth, because someone posted a week ago or 2 weeks ago that the predicted headline of what the papers would start talking about, how that there would be an increase in an uptick in people being hospitalized who are double jabbed and who haven't had their booster. Inevitable headlines. And there, lo and behold, there it is, Fauci in America stating uh, a demonstrable uptick in those who have been double jabbed but not received their booster, which in many ways, of course, invalidates the efficacy of the first two jabs if it therefore requires a third. You're essentially publicly stating that the product doesn't work, it's deficient in its two-dose form, and you need a third. Common sense corner logic would prevail that once again, the same thing will happen after the third dose. It will continue to diminish. The product hasn't been enhanced in any way. Therefore, quite clearly, the same problem is going to recur within 2, 3, 4, 5 months. But at the same time, what are the impact on people's health? What's the impact on their immune system? What's the impact through adverse reactions and all these things? But none of this matters. There was an article in Scotland this week about this rise in childhood mortality within newborns. And some serious questions being asked of what's causing that. And I don't need to go into detail here. You can join the dots yourself. No one wants to listen. No one wants to pay attention to facts or evidence. We are living in a post-truth era where truth doesn't matter, where facts don't matter, where ideology rules. And the ideology is that the vaccinations are a moral imperative in order to participate in society, to participate in employment. And this has been decided by these central powers that have a ginormous level of control over society. In fact, the industry such as the big pharmaceutical industry and the digital identity industry, Pfizer, for instance, have made $36 billion in profit from the COVID vaccinations. They're also now profiting from drugs that treat some of the adverse reactions. Well, that is a genius business model, isn't it? Create a product that creates a new problem and then create a new product that solves that problem. What a great way to profit from every end. The digital identity industry is poised to double in the next 5 years. These major institutions hold and wield much power. The World Economic Forum talks about private-public partnerships. Essentially, it's a lobbying ground for the global elites, the unelected global elites, to inflict their ideology upon the Western world through governments. And if you hadn't spotted it already, you might want to clue yourself in on the World Economic Forum's latest activity, which I'll cover in full next week. They actually ran an event last week called none other than The Great Narrative. The Great Narrative. If you couldn't be more overt, you couldn't be more explicit than calling an event a 2-day offsite where over 50 unelected elites gathered in Dubai, I believe, to thrash out over 2 days the great narrative for the future, for the storyline that the world will follow, which unsurprisingly continues to erode individual human rights and prioritizes the collective good, this radical collectivism whereby we become enslaved to the global elites and progress towards this extreme socialist or communist ideology, which has been driven for the greater good. We've been hoodwinked. It's quite clear that people have been hoodwinked into this idea that you follow this pathway to the greater good, in the same time erode all of your own individual rights. It's quite futile. So there we have the great narrative to follow the great reset. In short, there is a war on the unvaccinated. It's an ideological battle in a post-truth era where facts and evidence do not matter. The question then becomes, what can we do? Because in the first instance, society is permitting this. And what you permit, you promote. I mentioned in a tweet earlier on today and on Facebook, I said that I previously never understood how regimes like the Nazis came to power. I couldn't get my mind around how, they would go from a single individual to forming a party, to taking control, and to an ideology gripping over a nation. Well, now I can fully understand. Because what we're going through right now, the war on the unvaccinated, can only be described as medical fascism. It's medical fascism. It's an ideological warfare imposed upon humanity. And that just if even if you don't want to go to that level of extremes in your thinking, even if you don't want to confront that, and you want to just take it on the surface level, what is happening is our right to bodily autonomy is being eroded. You can see it through vaccine mandates. You can see it through vaccine passports. You can see it through unvaccinated only lockdowns. Your ability to choose what to put in your body is eroding. Now, there are many people who are in fear and they think it's justified based upon this respiratory virus. But again, if we if we go back to common sense corner and address the actual evidence once again, for the vast majority of people, COVID-19, if people have forgotten already, is largely mild or even asymptomatic for the vast majority of infections. Of course, that doesn't take away from the sad and tragic outcomes from those who are more vulnerable. But we have to look at what caused those, what creates those vulnerabilities. And people with adverse health outcomes, people who are obese, people who smoke, have more tragic outcomes, more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to have severe symptoms, more likely to die. We need to confront the fact that it's not your vaccination status that determines your health outcome. It may influence it, it may not. It's your health status. And the way that we influence our health status is not just by creating this culture of over medicalizing and trying to find a vaccine for every possible illness, trying to outsource our immune system. It is about bolstering and protecting our immune system through nature, and through actually living healthily. That would be a positive outcome. But that does not align with the technocratic vision of the future, whereby everything is monetized. Everything is monetized and profit is gained from even your innate immune system. We can see it's not a conspiracy theory. You can see, look it up for yourself. The definition of herd immunity is now based upon a vaccine threshold, which you can translate to a pharmaceutical revenue threshold, if you will. People say, when is this over? And I said, well, it depends on what the revenue targets are for big pharma and when they hit them, because they aren't done yet. They aren't done yet. Booster 3, 4, 5, 6. They're pushing towards a subscription service. Essentially, it won't be long before you get it through your door. Like a monthly subscription box. This is the world that we're heading towards, and even if it doesn't happen with this vaccine, it's going to happen with the next. This is the way of the world, and there is billions and billions to be made from situations like this. And I just can't believe that people can't see through the ideology, through the fog. Through the misrepresentation and the misinformation that are put out by governments and central authorities, to see the roots of all of this power, greed, and control. So the question then becomes: how do we start to move through this? How do we start to tackle this if we do consider this to be a war on the unvaccinated? It to me becomes a very much a spiritual battle, because all of this is predicated on fear. It's predicated on cultural safetyism. It's predicated on scarcity. It's predicated on the idea that we are dangerous to each other and to society and the planet, if you go into the climate change narrative. So number one is we must shift the narrative. There is a very simple narrative that the governments and the central authorities have been playing consistently with simplicity. It's easy. They've taken a very simple narrative. So number one, we have to start shifting the narrative, and we have to start going back into our own values and understand. And I ask myself, where are the libertarians? Britain, America, whether you identify to the term libertarian or not, or a classic liberal, for instance, someone who values civil liberties, individual rights, human rights. Where are these people in the droves? Because I thought we lived in a free and open society. I was mistaken. I thought I lived amongst people who valued freedom. I'm mistaken. Within just 2 years, people now demonize freedom as though it's the enemy of the people. It's quite frankly shocking how powerful this coercive narrative has become. So, sorry, losing my voice there. We must first begin to shift the narrative. And there are incredible ways we can do that. And there are a lot of smart people who can help us to do that. But what we must be careful that we do not become within shifting the narrative is becoming the opposite point of view and just simply creating a counter narrative, because it's really not just about bursting the narrative. It's actually it's tapping into the underlying forces. What to me it's really all about, whilst we do need to shift the narrative and create a counter narrative, it's about coming back to conscious awareness. It's about the whole principle of being here now, to be able to disconnect from the things that shape your reality, because perception creates our reality, and our perception is created by the media and all these different sources. It's about being able to disconnect from that, come back to conscious awareness, so that we don't have to rely upon narratives. We can rely upon our own intuitive guidance and our own conscious awareness, which becomes informed by conscious exploration of fact, using reason, which human beings are perfectly capable of. But here we are being treated like children of the state. When we're growing up, my little boy here, who's 10 weeks old, he relies upon me and his mother, Lizzie. We need to look after him in order for him to survive. But he will grow up and become dependent. He'll grow up and become capable. He'll grow up and become capable of making his own decisions, as most of us adults are. I say most because there's a few that I wouldn't trust with decisions, as case in point, what we're seeing now in the world. But nonetheless, we become adults and we become capable of making our own decisions. We become capable of using reason and logic in order to make sense of the world. But we are treated as though we are incapable citizens. We are treated as though we do not have logic and that we do not have reason. We are treated as children of the state, and that we must be mollycoddled and nannied. This idea of the nanny state, that we are children of the state, with this paternalistic relationship, as we're the naughty children, will be sent to our rooms and do what we're told. The reality is we are responsible adults. We are smart people. We are capable of reason, and we are capable of living through our individual rights as well as protecting the collective interests of society. But when we prioritize one or the other, excess individual rights or excess collectivism, what we're seeing right now is a function of radical collectivism. But it's a cultural trend that's on the rise. And this great narrative event that I told you about is a reflection of that radical collectivism, which is a danger to society. It really is. It's one of the highest risk mentalities to society as we know it. It's really quite frightening. So firstly, shift the narrative, create a counter narrative. But number two is to call out the game. To call out the game. I did an interview with Professor Matthias Desmet quite recently on here. It's now had over 1 million views on all platforms. Just an incredible interview that's been shared widely. Professor Robert Malone tweeted it today. 1,400 people retweeted the video. Unbelievable amount of people watching this video, because what it does is it makes sense of the game. It calls out what's going on. It calls out the reasons why we fall into authoritarian regimes. It calls out the kind of precursors to authoritarianism. It looks through history and psychology and behavioral science to understand what's led to what we're experiencing right now. But it also looks at the public factors. It looks at why people comply and why people fail to question the narrative. It really shines a light. It looks a helicopter view on what's really happening. It enables us to call out the game. And by calling out the game, we start to lift the lid of trust on the central institutions, because, as I said, facts and figures don't seem to matter. But once you lift the lid of trust and you get past that haze of ideology, you pierce the veil and come to the other side, come back to conscious awareness, you see, quite frankly, that you're being lied to and misled. You are being coerced, lied to, misled, misrepresented, and that's downright unacceptable. So it's about calling out the game. That's the second thing. It's probably one of the most important things we can do, is to call out the game, because it's not then about the facts and the figures. It's about the game that's being played and how people are being played. Number three is to mobilize, because the war on the unvaccinated is not just a war on the unvaccinated. It's actually a war on our liberal Western values. It's a war on individual rights, and that is not exclusive to the unvaccinated. That is a societal issue. So that's why when you see the Together Declaration behind me, when you go to the rallies that support, you stand against vaccine passports, you'll find plenty of people who are pro-vaccine. They've been double jabbed and triple jabbed, etc., because they recognize this isn't just about health. It's not just about safety and efficacy of a vaccine or a war on the unvaccinated. It's about government overreach. It's about centralization of power, and it's about putting that power back in check, because these ministers are drunk on power right now. So we need to mobilize, and we don't just need to mobilize the unvaccinated. Good thing there's millions of us in every nation, in varying proportions. But we do need to mobilize and unify with our fellow brothers and sisters, colleagues, etc., to talk about how we stand against this totalitarian regime, which is essentially eroding our values of freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, our broader human rights, These freedoms are under risk, under threat right now, and it's not exclusive to the unvaccinated. So we need to mobilize people, because when we start to mobilize, we start to show the majority that we are not the minority anymore, and that we start to grow. So number 4 is then mass non-compliance. Mass non-compliance, because even if you are threatened by what is happening economically, physically, mentally, the reality is if we comply, we fail, we lose. Non-compliance is the ultimate way out of this. But we need to first shift the narrative, call out the game, begin to mobilize so we get social proof, strength in numbers. And then with mass non-compliance, we start to show the government that we do not consent. And the governments rely on consent. And then we need to look at how we start to dilute the incumbent power structures. Now, this is important. I've been doing a lot of work on this. I've been working with a lot of the campaign organizations to talk about the pillars of power. The pillars of power. The pillars of power are the segments of society that uphold the government's power. So, for instance, public compliance is one of them. The healthcare system is one of them. The big tech, big industry, business, law enforcement, military. All of these are pillars of power that upholds the government's ability to enforce policy upon its citizens. But when we start to draw that power away, and take Austria, for example, where the protesters this weekend, it's my birthday tomorrow, and I'm going to be celebrating my birthday. Unfortunately, it means I won't be going to any of the protests, but I do need to go and spend some time with my friends and my family. But I stand in solidarity with Austria and every other country and every other nation that is under threat right now from this war on the unvaccinated. But in Austria, the military and the police are saying they are not going to enforce this war on the unvaccinated. They will not enforce it. So this is when we talk about the pillars of power. We look at the military, for instance. If we can extract the military support of the government when it comes to enforcing these particular policies. I'm not saying they should defect altogether. This is a totalitarian global regime. It's not a dictatorship. But if we can get the government, these pillars of power to defect in terms of their support for these particular mandates, then we stand in a very strong position. So we need to understand the pillars of power that's upholding the government's ability to enforce these narratives and these policies and start to pull that power away. That does include working with the politicians themselves to pull their support away. Because believe me, you'll see from the Together Declaration stunt in London this week, Steve Baker, Graham Brady, these have been very consistent, but their advocacy is growing, as is those around them. So the MPs, if you watch the coronavirus debate, even though it was a complete farce and the fact that they laughed the vote out of the building, you could see that those that did attend the Coronavirus Act protest, those that did speak at the debate, are beginning to get frustrated with the status quo. They're beginning to become disillusioned with the erosion of democracy. They're becoming disenfranchised with the way that politics is emerging in the modern world in the UK. So this creates a level of vulnerability where we can start to pull support from the political pillar. We can start to work with the NHS colleagues to support them, because isn't it ironic that the government call the NHS our NHS, and it's all about protecting and saving the NHS. Yet here they are in next year enforcing vaccine mandates, which will cause hundreds of thousands of job losses. And how much hypocrisy can you tolerate when they postpone that decision, recognizing that decimating the NHS prior to the winter season would absolutely destroy the healthcare system and ultimately destroy the public support. So lo and behold, they postponed it to spring. We'll make use of you. We'll use you and abuse you over the winter. We'll put you through one of the toughest winters you've had yet because of our decisions that have created these enormous problems that you're facing. And then next year, in the way to thank you, we'll either force you to get a jab or you can lose your job. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. So there's a level of support there within the NHS. And remember, the COVID pass in the UK is sponsored by the NHS. Imagine you start to get the NHS to align with the public to stand against these mandates. Wouldn't it be amazing if the NHS said we're not going to provide the data that fuels these COVID passes? Now, this is big picture thinking. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's about getting an understanding of where these levers are in order to create influence. And then you've got the things like the media. The media come across as completely bought, but it's about looking at what are the angles that can be addressed in order to start to wake people up to what's really happening. And then finally, deselecting the individual leaders, because what's going to happen within this is society is on its way to somewhat collapsing. And as a result of societal collapse, these leaders will pay the price with their jobs. That's almost inevitable at some point. Referencing what Professor Desmet said on his interview of the Pandemic podcast, I encourage you to watch it. Fascinating interview. You need to have a look at that interview, because it explains that authoritarian regimes will ultimately burn themselves out. They'll create their own demise. They will self-sabotage, and you can see that happening. You know, that the stronger that the public push, the harder the harder people resist, the stronger governments push back, and the more ridiculous they become, the more ludicrous they become, and as a result, they create their own demise. And I have every faith that that will happen by its own accord, but will be accelerated by the resistance that is placed upon them. So, whilst we can, in the meantime, have faith that it will come to its own demise, and I strongly believe that it will. We need to start thinking about the individual leaders that need to be deselected, because the perpetrators of this situation, this war on the unvaccinated, this crimes against humanity that have been unfolding throughout this period of the pandemic response, which it is very difficult to describe it in any other way. If you've been paying full attention to what's going on, at least. If you haven't, then you might think I'm crazy. But having spent over a year analyzing this in depth, watching every scientific element, every social, cultural, economic, political, technological angle around this, referencing history to teach us what is happening here, it's very clear that there are mass crimes against humanity occurring right now. And at the very least, if you can't buy in at that level, certainly violation of human rights at the simplest level, and the erosion of individual choice is very, very clear, with grievous harms to individuals and members of society. So there are multiple things we can do. It comes with challenges, of course, but recognize that the resistance itself, whilst many believe is futile, it will accelerate the demise of these totalitarian leaders. What can we do in the interim is the big question. And this is a mental, emotional, and spiritual battle in many ways. So for the winter that comes, that we face a potential bleak winter, both in terms of weather and the COVID situation, which seems to be self-created by the way that we've what's the term? We've over intervened. Human intervention is once again. There's a Graham Hancock says that you'll find many crises are a function of over human intervention. This is very much an example of excess human intervention once again, creating more harm than good, thinking that we can play God, whereas actually what people do need to find now is faith in something beyond themselves, and find the emotional and mental strength to tolerate what is going to happen over the next few months, to prepare themselves for what is happening physically, emotionally, mentally. But also it's an opportunity for us to evolve spiritually. I do believe this is a spiritual battle, and everything is driven out of fear, out of scarcity. There's slithers of evil, people would say, around what's happening. So in order to transcend that, we must lead with love. We must first look at what are the things practically we can do, yes. But if we take those actions out of fear, frustration, anger ourselves, then we simply create more fear, anger, and frustration in the world. We create a boomerang effect. So it's time to lead with love. It's time to take on a new mode of leadership. It's time to live with compassion. It's time to restore humanity, because ultimately that is what the gaping hole has been left. This earthquake, this asteroid dent in the planet that has been created by the response to COVID-19 is a gaping hole which can be filled by love and potentially something. Faith in a spirit or higher power or God beyond ourselves. There's a mighty hole, and I'm not religious. I don't follow any particular religion or gods, but I do believe that there is a universal fabric that connects us all, everything, all beings, all things, that vibrates amongst all of us, and that we are one. So it becomes an immense spiritual battle, because What will emerge from this, I believe, is a higher vibration. There is going to be an energetic shift amongst the people. I very much believe we're at the precipice of a counterculture revolution, a counterculture movement, much akin to what we saw in the 1960s with the Summer of Love, where masses of people shunned the direction, the trajectory that society was upon, and said, "We are not going in that direction. We're going to build a new future in the shell of the old. We're going to live with love. We're going to focus on personal empowerment and self-actualization and higher consciousness and healthy living and intentional communities, and we're going to restore the values of liberal politics and open democracy." And I feel like we're exactly at the precipice of that point right now. And I want to dedicate the rest of my time uh, within this movement to help bring that change around, to lead, to help co-lead this movement as a spiritual movement that brings loving energy to the world, and helps transform our consciousness in a way that helps every individual to become the leaders that they were born to be, to become self-empowered, so that we can become self-sufficient and we don't rely upon the state outside of ourselves, uh, and become leaders of the future. Because right now, the great narrative, the great reset, the vision of the future that these institutions and individuals paint for the future is bleak. It's all dressed up. It's all dressed up in fine clothing, but underneath it is a dark core. So it's down to us to now look to how we can restore humanity. The spiritual element of it as well also encompasses the idea of forgiveness. And I was listening to Ramdas this morning, first thing with my morning coffee, and he was talking about protests. He was talking about activism, and he's talking about loving your oppressor as much as you love your friends and your family and your loved ones. Loving your oppressor as much as you love i.e., love your enemy as much as you love your friends. And that becomes a spiritual battle. That becomes a spiritual evolution. For many people, they couldn't ever possibly love someone else. But if you think about it, what's really happening is, if we don't do that, we're creating more of a divide. We're creating more of an us and them. And the real solution is unity. The real solution is oneness. The real solution is love. And we cannot create that by demonizing others. We cannot create that by creating a wider wedge. And actually, those that are subjugating the planet to the crimes that they're right now, the pain that people are being put through, is because those people are in trauma. Those people are in pain. Those people are uh, even the megalomaniacs are coming from a place of trauma. And love is the answer, even to those people. So the greatest spiritual evolution here is to find a way to forgive those that have trespassed upon us, and to also to love our enemies as much as we love our own, because that's how we truly transcend this. That's how we go beyond the fear-based mentality. That's how we stop throwing boomerangs out and getting smacked in the head. This is how we start to create a ripple that can become a wave. This is how we create a wave of change. And this is why I believe that the transformation is about a spiritual transformation that brings and restores the value of humanity, that protects and upholds the Western values of civil liberties, democracy, human rights, but advocates for a more conscious future, a more conscious and deliberate future that places a value on the human soul, as well as the planet that we live on. And that is ultimately what I believe is necessary in this post-truth era that we're living in, where the war on the unvaccinated is just beginning. It's really, really quite challenging, but it's a challenge to us all to evolve. In many ways, this is a spiritual revolution, people will call it, but we don't need to revolve. Revolve means to go around in circles. Life continually goes around in circles. This is our opportunity to transcend that. If you follow any of the Ken Wilber's work on spiral dynamics, you'll know that this is an opportunity for us to transcend our current conscious awareness into a newer, higher level. I do believe that this is an opportunity for conscious transformation, an opportunity to transform consciousness around the world. And in doing so, we will create a better world. We will create a better energy around the world, and these things will dissolve. These illusions that have been created will dissolve. These fears will dissipate amongst us, and we will enter a new realm where the opportunity is rife to build a better future for the people and the planet, and for generations to come. So hopefully I can end on a positive note. Whilst things are bleak right now, we need to prepare ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Hopefully I've given you some insight in terms of some of the ways that the resistance can be built. And the resistance, I do believe, will help to accelerate the decimation of this authoritarian regime. But alongside that, what's absolutely critical is we start to think forward. We start to think consciously forward about the world we want to see, the systems of power and structures we want to see, and we must do that out of a place of love rather than fear, because otherwise we'll just create more. we'll abolish one system and create more of the same. It's time that we move away from the trap of the pendulum and swinging from one problem to another. It's time that we evolve. Conscious evolution is what creates the opportunity for us to go in a different direction from here. So it's time to transcend our consciousness. If we can help transcend the global consciousness through this period, then we will win. We will win as a humanity. And when I say we, I mean all of us, every one of us, including those who oppress us. So hopefully leave you that message of hope. Now, for those who wanted to join the resistance, I did say it's my birthday tomorrow and I won't be joining the protests. I'll be there in mind and spirit, but not body. There's protests all over the UK, all over the world tomorrow, the worldwide demonstrations. There's protests in London, there's protests in Bristol, there's protests all over the UK, all over Europe. If you are free and available, I encourage you to go and join your fellow citizens and participate in the resistance. Join the protests that are taking place all over the UK and further beyond this weekend. Stand in solidarity with our friends in Austria and different parts of the world. We're all in this together, and together we will transcend what is happening. But do go join the resistance. Have a wonderful weekend. Live with love. And I look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Have a beautiful weekend. Please do subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast if you haven't done so already. Just takes a minute of your time. Just go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. And there's my boy. Bring Zaki over. my wife is just there's my boy Zaki. This my man is the future. This is why I do what I do.
Daddy's inciting a riot.
Daddy's not inciting a riot. He's inciting a peaceful transformation of the world so that your future is a more beautiful place.
And that's why he's dressed as a prisoner, because he's ready.
Yeah, dressed as a prisoner because of the war on the unvaccinated. Yeah, you've got your Alcatraz suit on. Right, it's your time for a bath, isn't it, matey?
Yes, please, Daddy.
Yes, please, Daddy. All right, on that note, peace and love to you all. Please subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast, danjgregory.com/pandemic. Enjoy your weekend. See you again next week. Peace and love to you all. See you again.